the federal Liberals introduced climate accountability legislation in Parliament today, and we're going to be talking to Elizabeth May from the Green Party about her party's criticism of that legislation. So welcome to the interview, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Now, I reviewed your climate plan, your party's climate plan prior to the last election. It was very much a war footing. We have to throw all the resources that we have at the issue of solving the climate crisis. Is your take on this legislation consistent with that framework?
Exactly. And, we've learned a lot since last year's election, because for a lot of people, this idea of a whole of government response, recognizing we're in an emergency, what a government can actually do when seized with a problem, seemed pretty hard to imagine a government doing that on anything. Well, now we've seen our government do that on COVID, right? So we're past the point where so many Canadians would say, oh, gee, but would a government really act? I mean, if so we know governments can act, right? We know if we're in an emergency and we recognize it as an existential crisis, which the climate emergency is, our government does know how to respond, and we can quibble around the margins, but there's no question but that we had a whole of government approach, and we still do in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. What we did as Greens in the last election campaign is say, well, if we're going to call for Canada to play our fair share of and to pull our fair share of the load in meeting what the international scientific community says we must do to hang on to a livable world, well, that requires significantly more than we're currently committed to doing. And what we're currently committed to doing, we're not on track to achieve. So that's where we're still at the place where we were in Mission Possible, that we need to double our target. And I like the fact that the government says we're going to be accountable for our targets. That's good. But they don't want to put a target out there that they have to account for till 10 years from now. And that's just not leadership.
I've got the press release in front of me, and here are some of the issues that your party has with the legislation. You want a detailed carbon budget. You want, and it's setting out GHG emissions allowed to keep within the 1.5 degrees C threshold, a carbon border adjustment, which is very interesting, investments in renewable energy and clean tech, deep energy retrofits of buildings, annual increases in the carbon tax. Some of those things seem to me already in Liberal climate policy. The carbon border adjustment, I don't think is.
No.
Could you explain that?
Yeah, and that's something that we've called on for quite some time. Annamie Paul, our leader, has been very clear in saying if you're going to have a carbon tax that applies to the Canadian economy, then we can't be letting goods across our border that have been manufactured in ways that didn't take into account the carbon. In other words, we don't want to undercut our own manufacturing by bringing in, as we do bring in so much imported goods and services that don't themselves adjust for whatever carbon pricing there was in a country of origin. The European Union has been talking about this for years. They want a carbon border price adjustment. New Zealand is already committed to that. It only makes sense, and we could expand it, of course, Canada and the US together, now that we know President-elect Biden is probably going to be doing carbon pricing, make sure that we don't have unfair competition from elsewhere.
Final question, Elizabeth. Another interesting idea that you proposed wasn't in the legislation, and that is a national electricity corridor allowing 100% renewable energy to flow across provincial and territory borders. That makes sense, especially in Western Canada, because as we electrify economies, that's part of climate policy, that's where the technology is going anyway, then we need to deal with intermittency of wind and solar. And if we have, hydro in Manitoba, hydro in BC, if it's all tied into a regional grid, we can do that. Have I got that correct?
You've got it right. And it should be east, west, and north, south. There's some very innovative, and these are entrepreneurs. This is private investment money going into, for instance, expanding the grid into the territories. We need to be able to take some of the northern communities off of diesel, for example. But certainly, and this is one of the maddening things about our wonderful federation. You look at the European Union, which is separate nation states, and separate nation states in Europe are doing a better job getting renewable energy from one jurisdiction to another than we are in Canada. So for instance, Denmark has so much wind energy now, they can't, it would essentially kind of blow up their grid if they had all that wind energy all at once just in the grid in Denmark. So they sell it to Norway. Then Norway uses the excess wind energy, and because they're easy to do pump storage. This is something that all Canadians should know about because it makes so much sense. We could use abandoned quarries at elevation. Anytime you can pump water up using excess wind power or excess any renewable power into a location where a dam holds in place till the wind isn't blowing. Then you let that water go, and then the next time you've got excess wind, you pump it back up. Pumped storage is an easy way to go, but between Norway and Denmark, they've got more figured out than we do between Manitoba and Ontario, and for that matter, BC and renewable energy into Alberta. And Alberta producing, I mean, Alberta's a renewable energy powerhouse. I mean, the amount of solar that's possible out of Alberta is so important to being able to build an economy and rely on 100% renewable electricity coast to coast to coast. It's doable, and that's something that I know that some of the Liberal investments, the Liberal government investments, are going in that direction. Specific interties are being funded, but the big picture to talk about an electricity corridor is something that Canadians can get behind.
One last question, because I'm really interested in this, given the pandemic, and that is deep retrofits of buildings. During the campaign, Prime Minister Trudeau promised 1.5 million buildings would be retrofitted. I forget the date. It might be 2025, might be 2030. But boy, if you ever want to put people back to work in a hurry and do something good for reducing emissions, that would seem to be just, a no-brainer. Why do you think it wasn't in the legislation?
Well, there's nothing in the legislation in terms of detail, right? So what we could very well be there, but the idea of the legislation is that within 6 months, but with a 3-month window of the bill entering into force, the government would then have to come up with a detailed plan. My specific reason that this isn't a useful piece of legislation is that they say the first plan will be to get to a target in 2030. Make this bill about getting to a target by 2025. Pick a target and say, okay, we're going to get there by 2025 so that we know we're on track to what we need to do by 2030. And then from then on, they access every 5-year increments going out to 2050. So yeah, we're going to have a lot of energy building retrofits. And as you say, not only is it great for getting people back to work, it's in every region of the country, every part of the country, every electrician, every carpenter, every plumber, everybody in the skilled trades work. We will have more work than we have people to do it, making sure that our buildings aren't wasting our money and wasting our energy, heating the outdoors in the winter and cooling it down in the summer, which is what our buildings tend to do. It's a big chunk of greenhouse gases. The same thing for installing renewable energy, getting a grid built. These are all great job creators, and they pay for themselves, but we need to incentivize them. We need to get it started. And that's where this bill could be massively improved if they just cranked up that first date from our plan goes to the first target of 2030, 10 years from now, come on. First target 5 years from now. Then we've got a workable piece of legislation that meets the demands of the science.
Elizabeth May, thank you very much. Really appreciate this. And I'm sure we'll have you back on here. This is the first time we've interviewed you, but I'm sure it's not the last.
Thank you, Markham. It's been lovely to chat with you. Thank you very much.